When you're building your characters in Last Epoch, you'd like to have the best affixes possible in all of your gear slots. It's especially important for your helmet, for your body armor, and for your relic, because that's where the class-specific affixes roll, and that's where they're available to you. So whether it's offensive or defensive, or just something spicy that your class has access to, you'd like them. You want all of those in your build. So if you're playing Warpath, for example, sure, you can type in Warpath, Control F, and you'll see that plus levels to Warpath exists, and that's good. But what about the sneaky modifiers? What about the spicy modifiers? Something that you might not have thought about that you could include in your build. Something that's not immediately obvious. So to that extent, we have a video here for you today answering that question in particular. These are going through all 5 classes, through the class-specific modifiers that roll again on your helmet, your body armor, and on your relic, and we'll talk about what you might want to include in your next build. So the first class that we're going to start with is Primalist. I'll walk through the helmet and the body armor, and if there's anything spicy that comes up, we'll talk about the relic as well, because the relic is only going to have plus levels, and that might come up in some of the other classes. But let's start here. So Primalist. The first things that we have here for a helmet slot are 2 prefixes, and they look kind of normal, but let's talk about them for a moment. This is cooldown recovery speed while transformed, and then critical strike multiplier while transformed. The 2 things that I wanted to mention in particular about these, you might say crit multi, everybody knows that you're supposed to control that crit multi. This is generic crit multi, and I think that's really neat. This is not only crit multi for spells, not only for melee, and in particular, if you're also using Salt the Wound in order to convert your generic critical strike multiplier into no longer effect, but bleed penetration and poison penetration, or penetration with those respective ailments, this will apply to the Salt the Wound unique gloves. And I think that's pretty neat. The reason that cooldown recovery speed is a notable prefix on a piece of gear these days is that cooldown recovery speed is no longer a prefix. In the past, you could have double prefix modifiers with cooldown recovery speed and cooldown recovery speed while transformed on your helmet, but instead we have cooldown recovery speed on other pieces of gear, and no other class has access to cooldown recovery speed on the helmet, except for Primalist. Now, before we move on to the body armor for the Primalist, we have 2 more affixes to touch on real quickly, and that is increased aspect of the link's effect, and also minion critical strike multiplier. So the reason that these are interesting is, well, aspect of the links is a lot more powerful than people give it credit for, unless you've used it, because it's very, very strong. So you could say a Beastmaster only has access to aspect of the links. Maybe that's why it's less popular, because Druid tends to be very popular. But aspect of the links gives you 100% increased critical strike chance, 100% stun chance, and also 60 crit multi. And if you have 25% increased effect of aspect of the links, that alone, on top of the 25 critical strike chance, is another 15 crit multi. If you can work this into your build, either sealed as tier 1 or maybe exalted tier 7, this is a great way of juicing some extra damage. The second modifier here is a little bit more generic, but I still think it's worth talking about. Remember, especially if you're a Path of Exile player out there, that minion critical strike multiplier does apply to your totems as well. If you're playing Thorn Totem, or if you're playing a Storm Totem build, minion crit multi is exactly the kind of thing that you want for your totems too. And rounding out the body armor slot for what we have access to as a Primalist, this is not sealed tier 5. We'll talk about sealed modifiers later, but the body armor has access to, as a Primalist, crit multi while transformed, which again applies to your Salt the Wound if you're playing a bleed or poison build. The aspect of the link's effects going up to 38% this time instead of only 25 on the helmets, and then also the minion crit multi that we previously talked about. These are on your chest piece. Keep note of those. Moving on to the second class that we'll be talking about here, we have Mage. So we talked about Primalist, and now let's talk about some Spellcaster stuff. So for a helmet slot, we've got a couple interesting things here. Probably not used as often as it ought to. Damage dealt to mana before health. Consider it this way. As long as you have the mana, damage dealt to mana before health is damage reduction. If you're using a skill that costs a lot of mana and you're constantly going down to 0, then maybe this is not something for you. But if you're playing something like Glacier, perhaps, that has a mana refund mechanic in it, or maybe Mana Arc, or maybe you're just doing something else, maybe using Mana Tunnel from Teleport to give you a bunch of mana refund, this is the kind of thing that can give you damage reduction in a place that you normally wouldn't be able to. The second modifier on the helmet here, this is Lightning Critical Strike Multiplier. Notable because if you're only typing in the name of your skill, you might not know that this exists. So this is a good reason to be a Lightning build, aside from Lightning getting +1 Blessing, because you also get Lightning Shred on a blessing that does not have an opportunity cost in the slightest. You also get some extra critical strike multiplier, and your mastery gives you some extra critical strike chance. So lightning damage, along with shock, still looking pretty good in 0.9. The third modifier here, I typed it in as a sealed modifier, but I would not expect you to seal this. Maybe a sealed tier 1, but it's fine. This is increased spell critical strike chance and doubled if you have over 300 mana. This doubling over 300 mana or over 200 mana in the mastery itself, this mana specific stuff in the Sorc builds tends to be very cool. You could take a mana blessing if you're not a lightning damage build. Taking it from Lagan is a nice way of juicing some extra damage. And then getting a crystal wand instead of the normal Dragonhorn wand is a nice way of getting flat mana to get over that 200, and then in this case, a 300 threshold to double the benefit of some of these affixes. For the body armor of our mage builds, whether you're a Sorc or a Spellblade, these are still things you're interested in. We have more lightning critical strike multiplier, we have the increased spell crit chance, doubled if over 300 mana, and most importantly, and really most importantly, this is a sealed modifier that I recommend sealing at tier 1 because the tier 5 value is basically the exact same as the tier 1 modifier, +1 flame ward charge. Hopefully, if you're playing a mage build, you're speccing your flame ward as defensively as possible and grabbing a second charge of it. Along with this would give you 3 charges for your flame ward, which gives you a tremendous amount of uptime for your defenses. It's part of the playstyle of a mage. Sometimes you go into the fray, sometimes you run out of the fray, but as long as you have flame ward up, you know that you're not unkillable, but close. Moving on to our third class we'll be talking about. This is Sentinel. I actually had a hard time coming up with ideas for Sentinel aside from the helmet. So my helmets, and I play a lot of Void Knight myself, my helmets have very often started to look like this. I want as many levels on my volatile reversal as possible, giving me movement speed, cooldown recovery speed, maybe some extra void damage if I'm playing a Void Knight, but there's so many good nodes to be taking in volatile reversal because it's so strong. So as many volatile reversals as levels as possible, that's what I've been doing very often on my Sentinel builds, especially the Void Knights, but not only the Void Knights. Speaking of Void Knight, the other modifier here is plus levels to Anomaly. If you're a crit build and you want to be taking the critical strike chance nodes in Anomaly itself at the time bubble on the right side of that skill tree, this is excellent. This is exactly the kind of thing you want. If you're a non-crit build, then you might consider just skipping over the plus levels to Anomaly because without crit, you're not gaining that much from all the extra levels that you can get in the skill. But speaking of Sentinel, there's actually no other class where we're skipping the body armor slot. If you want plus levels to Warpath, you type in Warpath and you'll find out where it exists. But the thing that I think is most notable for you is grabbing +1 to Sigils of Hope. So if you're min-maxing your characters, if you're able to slip this in, having +1 to Sigils of Hope can often give you a little bit of flat damage, maybe a little bit of block chance, some extra duration, some percent increased damage, maybe some healing effect if you're playing a Judgment or a Holy Trail build. This is a little bit worse than it used to be because the plus levels to Sigils of Hope no longer give you flat armor. Instead, they only give you endurance threshold. So you'll have to check your Sigils of Hope skill tree before committing to this one. But it's pretty good considering that you can stretch all the way to get the block effect as well. Getting that +1 level. I mean, I like it. Even if it only gives you cast speed, it makes Sigils kind of less painful to play, and it's pretty good. Coming to our fourth class, we'll be talking about here, we have Acolyte, which is pretty firmly divided between the Necromancer and the Lich. There's not really much overlap there. This is a sneaky one, and it might look weird that I'm saying Vitality is something that you'll want to consider if you're not already considering it, because me, for someone who primarily plays in hardcore, I'm putting Vitality on all of my characters no matter what. But here's why Vitality might be more interesting to you as a Necromancer or as a Lich than you initially thought. So if you're playing Lich, remember you have 2 health bars, so you're almost getting twice as much out of Vitality as anyone else does. Not only that, but it's giving you flat armor from your Death Seal when you're turning that on. So assuming that you're using Death Seal, this is some meta analysis here, but if you're using Death Seal, Vitality is very, very good, gives you armor, gives you double health bar. You should probably be taking it. As for a Necromancer, you might be thinking Necromancer doesn't have defense, so Vitality helps to keep you alive. And in a way, I mean, you're not wrong, but you should... But the real reason is that in Dreadshade, there is a node that gives you armor based on your Vitality stat. So when you're building Vitality, not only are you building some extra defense for yourself, the health meta, etc., but you're also getting armor in another way. So Death Seal is giving you armor when you're playing Lich, Dreadshade is giving you extra armor when you're playing an Acolyte, when you're playing a Necromancer, assuming that you're speccing those skills in that way. Now, before we move on to our last class, we have 2 more modifiers to talk about here. One, you want as many levels as possible, and the other one, maybe just a sealed tier 1 modifier. So as a Lich, you're often transformed into Reaper form, so you get to take advantage of these well-transformed modifiers. We have up to 240% increased damage while transformed for both necrotic and for physical here. This is something that you miss out on if you're playing a non-necrotic, non-physical build. Ignite is very fun and I like it, but technically there's a small opportunity cost, and hopefully you're getting a different modifier on your prefix on your chest piece instead. And the last one, the sneaky sealed tier 1 modifier that you might not have been searching for, is +1 to Reaper form. There's actually a lot of good stuff in Reaper form. There's Marked for Death, there's crit multi, flat damage, attack speed, cast speed, percent damage, armor, poison resistance. There's a lot that you have the option to pick from, and it's hard to get everything. You need to start making some decisions, especially if you also want to work in the double movement skill that you need to spec into in Reaper form these days. So having a sealed +1 to Reaper form, this is something that I would consider pretty min-max and pretty good. Rounding out the last of our 5 classes here today is Rogue. There's a lot of good affixes on Rogue that you should know about. It was hard to pick just the ones that we wanted to share in this video. Remember, if you're using a dagger, if you're using a bow or a sword, type in while wielding a sword, or while wielding a dagger, while dual wielding. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And if you're playing a shuriken build, you type in shuriken and you find out that there's shuriken affixes and there's plus levels of shuriken. You'll find those things. So for the purpose of this video, let's talk about the sneaky modifiers that you might not have considered including in your build, and why I think they're good too. So for the first one here is plus levels to Acid Flask. Before you say anything, Acid Flask is not a great skill. I don't really recommend it. It's kind of bad. Okay, in any case, plus levels to Acid Flask is notable because the hybrid modifier is not percent increased damage. Very often percent increased damage, something like Sigils of Hope is percent, or like a little bit of flat mana, something like, Reaper forms, a little bit of flat health. But this one in particular gives you throwing speed, and it's hard to get throwing speed if you want this much of it. So you can get it on your rings, but maybe you're using a unique ring, maybe you don't have the LP for it. But if you need some extra throwing speed in your build, or even some sealed tier 1 throwing speed in your build, you can get plus levels to Acid Flask on your chest piece, and it's a nice way of getting some extra speed on your throwing builds. The second modifier here is one of my favorite modifiers that I just don't get to use often enough because I don't play Blade Dancers very often. And that is chance to gain Dust Shroud when you use a melee attack that hits. Notably, if you're playing something like Channeled Melee Flurry, this will not proc over and over and over because you only count as using that skill one time. So you could use non-channeled Flurry. I don't recommend that, but you understand the difference that I'm trying to call out here. If you're using a skill that hits very often, if you're playing Puncture along with your Bleed character, you might consider having this on your chest piece to get some extra Dust Shroud generation to really pretty easily cap your Glancing Blow chance. And remember, those Dust Shrouds, they even add to your damage, they give you more multiplier if you're playing something like Umbral Blades. And the last thing here for Rogue is another one of those sneaky sealed tier 1 modifiers that you can consider for the min-maxed version of your build, and that's +1 level to Shift. Shift can give you mana, more movement speed, more damage, maybe cleanses you, maybe 1 more point into the dodge rating for the extra second after you shift. There's a lot of good nodes that you can click into if only you had 1 or 2 more levels of the skill. So having plus level of Shift, similar to +1 level of Anomaly or +1 levels of Sigils of Hope, there's always that 1 more point of utility that you wish you had, and you can use a Glyph of Despair to get that. Now, we went through all 5 classes, but I think there's one more thing that we need to talk about because we are now in 0.9, and we've had some new affixes introduced to the game, and taking a look at the screen, some new base types introduced to the game. I am pretty close to saying that every single build should have double Opal Rings. Opal Rings are really, really good. They only give you 1 to 2 all attributes instead of a Coral Ring, which would give you, 5 vitality instead. But having all attributes gives you percent increased damage, gives you armor, gives you a little bit of ward retention, it gives you life, and it has cooldown recovery speed on it. There's a lot of cooldowns in this game, and if for nothing else, like your movement skill, your defensive skill, the buffs, the debuffs, it's really nice having double Opal Rings if you can make room for them in your build. But speaking of those, we also have cooldown recovery speed on your boots. So there's another one we'll talk about in a second here, but The suffix slot for your boots, you'd like to have hybrid life, of course, but there's not much else that you have to have on your pair of boots. You'd like to have crit avoidance somewhere. You'd like to have endurance somewhere. Unfortunately, endurance can't roll on boots, but those kinds of suffixes, you can sort those out in the rest of your build. If you can fit in cooldown recovery speed on your boots, I think it's a really good choice to be doing that these days. The reason that I'm not including the belt slot is, well, cooldown recovery speed also rolls on belts. You could do a sealed tier 1 if you'd like to as a suffix. It's kind of low value at that point. But for me, belt suffixes are kind of set in stone. You get percent life there, you get hybrid life there, and you're really happy when your belt gives you 500 to 600 extra life to your character. So if you're playing a non-health based character, or if you're playing something that has tons of effective HP from other sources, maybe something like a druid, for example, then maybe you could fit in some cooldown recovery speed there, especially if it's juicing up other forms of your defense as well with those cooldowns that it's benefiting. So I'm going to call out the double ult rings and the boots. If you can fit in cooldown and recovery speed on your belt as well without giving up too much life, kudos, because it's really good. So what do you think? Are these modifiers that you already knew about because you've been playing this game for 5,000 hours and your brain is huge? Or maybe are any of these modifiers news to you? Have you started thinking about Glyph of Despair or maybe sealing affixes that you weren't considering sealing in the past? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know how you are building your characters these days and what you're doing in order to get as much damage and defense and utility and quality of life out of your characters as possible. I like hearing that kind of stuff. So like always, if you enjoy seeing content like this, conversational, informational stuff about Last Epoch pop up in your YouTube feed, let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section here, leave a like, leave a subscribe, and let me know how you're building your characters and maybe what kind of video you'd like to see next. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.